So hi everybody, my name is Miriam Bradley. I'm a senior lecturer in the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. And I'd like to welcome you all to this event, which is called After the Cuts, USAID, UK aid spending and the future of the humanitarian sector. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers who bring really a wealth of relevant experience working at high levels in international agencies in the formal humanitarian system. I have Dr Jane Cocking, formerly Humanitarian Director at Oxfam and currently chair of ELRA, an organisation that seeks to solve complex humanitarian problems through research and innovation. And at ELRA, she's looking at the moment at a number of initiatives on the future of the humanitarian sector. She's also working a lot with Interaction, especially on issues related to protection. Our second speaker is Damian Lilly. He's previously worked with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and now works as an independent consultant, currently working on a think piece on the future of the grand bargain. And just a few days ago, earlier this week, I think, published a report on the potential for restructuring the UN. So I'm going to start the webinar by asking Jane and Damian a few questions about how they see the current state of humanitarian affairs and what expectations and hopes they have for the future. And we're then going to open up the discussion to include the audience. And at that point, you're welcome to ask questions either by raising your hand or by typing a question into the Q&A box. And I will do my best to collect questions either live if you raise your hand, or I'll also do my best to keep track of what's going on in the Q&A box. So the motivation for organising this webinar, or the point of departure, as I think you've all realised from the title, lie in the Trump administration's dismantling of USAID and then the Starmer government in the UK's decision to cut UK aid spending in order to fund higher defence spending. So while the headlines that we hear most about, I think, are focused on these funding cuts in these two countries, it seems to me that the sector is facing a crisis which runs sort of wider and deeper than these cuts. And by that, what I mean is that it's not just the UK and the US, and it's not just a question of money. So it seems to me there's also kind of a normative shift in terms of dominant thinking about the role and importance, both of international aid in general and of humanitarian aid specifically. So the first question I want to ask is, and I'll ask Jane first and then ask Damian to come in with his response and maybe a little bit of kind of conversation between us, is how you see this crisis playing out in different parts of the humanitarian sector and what worries you most about the kinds of impacts that we've seen to date. So I'll hand over to Jane.
Thanks, Miriam, and hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining this discussion, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So to just get us going, to answer your question, Miriam, I think one of the most worrying things is, as you've highlighted, this is not just a one-off. This is not just something that's happening in the US and the UK. This is a global trend. So if we just look at what is going to happen to a number of European aid budgets over the next couple of years, the Netherlands down 30%, France down 35%, Belgium down 37%. It is only Norway and Sweden as amongst the major donors who are not talking about reducing their commitment. And this global trend is deeply, deeply worrying. It's connected to political movements, it's connected to political zeitgeist, and it can only flow into other areas. And I really am very reluctant to start this discussion by an implied criticism of the British public, who are always habitually incredibly generous when it comes particularly to humanitarian crises. But it is impossible not to see this global trend flowing beyond government and obviously into the public sphere, because just as one example, and one example is not enough to draw a firm conclusion from, but I think it is a concern that when we look at DEC appeals for earthquakes over the last few years, the Nepal earthquake appeal in 2015 raised £87 million, Turkey 160, the Myanmar appeal within its first week, and that's always a good indicator as to how something's going to go. And it's usually, you can then spread that out over a month or so, is 16, 1-6. And, you know, there you can argue as long as you know, for a long time about timing, about perceptions and so on, but that level of difference cannot be ignored. And I think that is a really important thing to hold on to when we look into what happens next. So in terms of impact, what are we seeing and what's most concerning? I mean, I think the only place to start with this is, first and foremost, the impact of recent decisions, recent cuts, is on some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And in amongst a lot of the discussions and debates we hear, it's deeply worrying that sometimes that feels to get missed. It's about the food distributions that have stopped. It's about the clinics that are shut. It's about the women's refuges. I talk regularly to a colleague in Erbil whose window overlooks the doorway to a women's refuge, which was previously USAID funded. I was talking to her this morning, and she said there are still women queuing outside that door, hoping that it's going to open, and it closed weeks ago. And that is the impact and the deeply, deeply, profoundly worrying consequences of decisions that we've seen. Of course, it is also affecting organisations, particularly local and national humanitarian organisations, who habitually live much more from grant to grant, who don't have those reserves to draw on that the big international ones do. And they are the beating heart of a lot of communities. Talking and listening to a lot of the emergency rooms in Sudan, they have done amazing work in the last 2 years, and their work is being profoundly undermined. And I think the other thing that I would simply close by reflecting on is, again, personal experience of being involved in the leadership of a number of organisations, ELRA, but then others where I'm a trustee and where I also do work, is it is really making the management of the whole system much more complex and much more difficult. And that can as you know, you seek to spread things around to make the right decisions and so on. That is time consuming, and it undermines the central purpose of humanitarian organizations and the humanitarian system. And that's something that, again, is quite often missed, but I think important to highlight. And a final point, and I'd be really interested to hear what others think about this one. It's still quite surprising that in some parts of the humanitarian sector, the capacity for denial is huge. So I still have conversations with people in some parts of the sector where it's sort of, well, you know, this kind of thing happens, doesn't it? Well, yes, it does, but it has to be taken seriously. And there are still some places where perhaps it's not. So it's not only what the impact is, but where perhaps it should be perhaps felt a little more immediately. So those are just a few thoughts from the beginning, but I hope that gets us going.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And then over to Damian.
Yeah, no, thanks also for the invitation to be part of this, and it's really great to go you and everyone else who's joined, so thanks for that. I mean, maybe building a bit on what Jane has said, I think, you know, she was saying first and foremost, this is not just a UK or US phenomenon. This has been played out in a number of donor countries as well who've been cutting. It's also not, although we've seen the biggest cuts this year, peak aid was at the end of, or during 2023 when it was at its highest. So we'd actually seen this fall in funding actually start a couple of years ago, but very much accelerated now. As you said, I'm doing this think piece for the Grand Bargain at the moment, and I've gone through many reports before that's talked about humanitarian reform, and the first line is normally something along the lines of the humanitarian systems as an important junction or important time. And so there's been COVID, there's been other things before, and I think people feel that this is, there's always been the need for reform, but I think this is tangibly different what's happening now. I certainly think in my 25 years of working in the sector, I've never experienced or seen anything like this in terms of the impact. And the numbers are still being worked out because we don't know quite what level of US funding will remain. But I don't think it's beyond the realms of fantasy to think by the end of the year, humanitarian funding will be 50% of what it was a couple of years ago. So we're really looking at a humanitarian sector that could, cut in half basically from what it was before. And so that's what we're kind of dealing with. And the cuts that are occurring at the moment by different agencies in the order of at least 30 to 40%. And so we don't know past this year, is this going to continue into next year, and how much will it continue? In terms of the impact, I think as Jane's saying, the most thing that should be in the forefront of all our minds, the impact of the people who will not receive aid. And it's quite interesting that at the beginning of the crisis, actually agencies were quite muted about the impact of saving lives. Tom Fletcher, the UN's aid chief, he did a hard talk interview, and he really wouldn't use the word people are going to die. He's literally stepped out of, Afghanistan the last couple of days, and the big headline now is millions of lives will be lost. And that really is the impact of this. We don't know quite how many. You can calculate it in terms of people who don't receive, for example, HIV treatment, and people have made these calculations, but that's the ultimate cost of that. Where I'm based in Mozambique, just to give one example, it's the north of the country where there's the main humanitarian response. And WFP, the World Food Programme, were feeding or targeting at least up to 1 million people with assistance. They've now cut that down to 300,000 people. So if you look at it, now even globally, for every 10 people that needed assistance, even before this crisis, only 6 out of those 10 people were targeted for assistance. Now, with even less funding, we're talking in the realms of only 1, 2, or maybe 3 people at the most, would be receiving or any chance of receiving assistance. And I always think it's quite interesting to draw the analogy of like a health system. Do you imagine the National Health Service were only really treating 30% of patients? It would be an abomination. And so I think that's the real world impact of this. And then I think Jane, your point about denial, I think, there's a spectrum, and I think we'll get onto it. There's a spectrum of opinion about how much change is needed and how much of an impact we're seeing from denial to radical change. I think what's more positive, there was concern about the cuts. Then there was quite a lot of articles, actually, just everyone taking pop at foreign aid. Foreign aid doesn't work. And there's been some interesting, even I've read in The Guardian a couple of articles came out even yesterday about making the case for aid again, and aid actually is good. Aid can do the following things. And I think we need that kind of commentary about why, aid is in the interest of the UK and other publics. It's not only a moral thing, but it's also in our interest for the way we project ourselves around the world as well. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So kind of building on those responses, I guess, I'm interested to hear you reflect on kind of how you expect or anticipate the sector to change and adapt in the next 1 to 5 years. So, for example, Jane, you talked about European funders also cutting their aid budgets. Do we expect that the BRICS countries might step in and fill some of that funding gap? Or turning to the operational agencies, do we expect that there's going to be a really radical, and sort of picking up a bit on what you just said, Damian, do we think that there's really going to be a radical overhaul in terms of how they operate, in terms of how power and resources are maybe distributed across different actors? or yeah, like what might a radical overhaul even look like? Or do we expect that really it's probably just going to be changes at the margins, with agencies trying to adapt to the smaller budgets, but really trying to do so staying as close as possible to business as usual? And maybe, Damian, do you want to take this one first, and then we can hand over to Jane?
Yeah, so can you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. I mean, I think it's in terms of what's happening now and the perspective going forward. I think the main thing that, and also speaking to people today, is most of the agencies at the moment are we're in a crisis management mode, I think, and I think it's important to consider that. So projecting what's going to happen in the future, I think people are still just dealing with the here and now. And most of what's happening at the moment is the agencies are having massive cuts to their funding. They're having to cut their workforce, their programs by 30%, and they're taking quite a mechanical view to that by getting the financial people and the planning people within their organizations and trying to fit their numbers to this new reality. And so why that's obviously necessary, and there's many people's jobs are on the line and going through major organization overhaul, it's quite difficult at the same time then to look about what this systemic change might look like. So I think it's still to be borne out quite when we're going to emerge from this. And then in terms of what is being discussed, I think there's this humanitarian reset people might have seen about. This is what the emergency relief coordinator a few weeks ago was pitched as. This is what we're doing. He said we need to retreat, we need to reset, and we ultimately need to renewal. And so we're in the reset phase, and a series of proposals have come across about what needs to happen in terms of reform. And the people that I've spoken to, there's kind of the spectrum of views. There's the kind of minimalist views with people, and perhaps what Jane was saying, the people more in denial of we need to change things a bit, but actually we're going to carry on doing what we were kind of doing, and we want to defend our mandate and what we're doing. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there's the maximalist view who say, no, that's just not what's required. We need a fundamental reforming about what we need to do. And so out of this spectrum, there's inevitably a different views that people have, and we're emerging from that. And I think, certain decisions will be made in the next month, but I still don't think we've got a sense of picture where these bigger discussions about really rethinking where's the leadership going to come from, who's it going to involve, how people are going to be consulted at. From what the people I'm speaking, that hasn't happened yet. We haven't emerged into that stage, and it really needs to happen, because I think one of the big people's fear is it's kind of rearranging the deck chairs, and then we miss this moment and suddenly we end up with the same place with the same problems, and we haven't really tackled the underlying issues. So I think the skeptics is that's the real scenario we want to avoid. We really want to seize this moment. This is an opportunity to fundamentally change what we're doing.
Brilliant, thank you. And let me pass over to Jane.
Thanks, Miriam. And would you like us to take both what we think will happen and what we think should happen at the same time, or do you want to come to the should later?
Yeah, why don't you take both, and then we can go back to Damian for what he thinks should. I think he started hinting at it already there with the kind of like suggesting that we should seize the opportunity. But yeah, so by all means, take both questions together.
Thanks. I mean, I agree with Damian. I mean, I think what we are seeing is in effect a technical fix. Something that says, right, okay, this is what the humanitarian sector looks like. We simply need to focus it and narrow it down and make some choices. And that is a very technical approach, and it's espoused in the reset and the prioritization. What we seem to be missing, though, is that the humanitarian sector is all about crisis response. And what is the first lesson of crisis response? That you deal with the immediate first, and then you then move into your next phase when you deal with the longer term and the more thoughtful aspect of it. And that it is entirely understandable, I think, that the technical fix is what's coming, particularly from the UN aspect of the sector. It's their job, it's what they're doing, and I'm not arguing that it should be done, but it is only the starting point. It must only be the starting point, because what will happen as a result of that is that over the next 1 year, 5 years, however long, is that if you adopt that approach, which is essentially having the new system designed by the custodians of the old, then you will simply end up with doing the same thing but less. So there will be reduced expectations. Those reduced expectations will be fed by reduced information. And I think that's something else that we're really missing. I mean, the loss of FuseNet is only one example of, we simply will not have the information, the data on which to base humanitarian planning and response. And that is absolutely fundamental. And it's one of the first things that's gone. So if all we do is adhere to this technical fix, we will end up with reduced expectations. We will see some mergers amongst organizations, and we'll see some failures of organizations. And, if we seize the opportunity, then some of those mergers will be positive. There are things which could come out of this thinking, which could actually deliver something better. So, I could easily dive into where they might be, but that's probably another conversation altogether. And there will be some organizations who can't survive. That has happened before. And it will be a question of how they close and how they maintain their value within the overarching system, some of which will be possible and some of which won't. There will be, I think, some return of some funds, but I think they are more likely to be ad hoc and very context specific. So it is entirely likely, I think, in 2 or 3 years that you will see some of the donors who are withdrawing funding looking at it and saying, we simply must put money into X, but it will be done on this ad hoc sort of approach. And that means that the qualitative side of things and the connectivity within the sector will also go because of underinvestment in how things work. But I think what will happen if we simply take this technical starting point and then let things flow is that we will regress. I mean, I started my career over 30 years ago. I'm slightly alarmed to find working for ODA, working for DFID's predecessor, which was a politically marginalized tiny wing of the Foreign Office that nobody wanted to go to. Nobody ever knew what it was and nobody wanted to go to it when they found out where it was. And then, we've come through a thoughtful period of growth and development within the sector, and we are simply looping back. And I'm absolutely not going to finish my career in the same place that it started. If it's the if I and people like me who share the same ideas manage to do what we would really like to. And I think that where could and should we go is putting the human back in humanitarian. This is a global movement. Humanitarianism is not a technocratic approach to it started with a global solidarity movement, and it needs to get back there, and it needs to rebuild a voice. There needs to be radical simplification of the system overall. And I've just got a little slide as to Andrew, if you're able to share it, that would be super helpful. But if not, I can just talk to it. Thank you. This is a sort of reconceptualization of how the non-government humanitarian response world could be configured. So you absolutely have to put people affected by crises at the heart of it. those organisations who are best placed to respond in a particular context, at a particular time, they need to be supported and enabled. And of course, the majority of those will be national and local organisations. This is making all of our commitments to localisation real. And then the ring outside that is the organisations, whether they are international, whether they're national, whether they're government, whether they're non-government, who are focused not necessarily on driving their own operational responses, but on being really clear about what they have to offer and engaging in response where they have added value, but focusing on supporting others where they do not. And that will in itself make the system more efficient. And then the motivation for this needs to be a global solidarity movement. So it's just a very rough approach to how we might do it. It's a conceptual approach as opposed to a technical one. It would need the sort of governance and management structures adapted to it, but it's a different way of thinking. Thanks, Andrew. You can cut it now, but thank you for doing that so quickly. So this requires a huge amount of humility and awareness across the sector, I think, if we're going to be able to move on. But there is nothing new in this. This embodies the commitments that are in the Grand Bargain, the commitments that were made at the Humanitarian Summit, but it says we use this moment of crisis to really make them real. So I hope that takes us from where we are, and it is not saying that what is being done at the moment through the reset and the prioritisation should not be done. That is a first step. That is your initial, your quasi 72-hour response package. But we then have to move on to a much deeper and more thoughtful approach as we move into the next 5 years and beyond, because it has to transform the system. And if we don't come out of this moment of crisis transformed, we will not have learned the lessons of the past and look positively to the future. So a few thoughts on that one. But Damian, over to you, I think.
Yeah, maybe just to add quickly on that, kind of where we're going. I mean, some of the things that have just stopped happening, there's a FuseNet, which is the famine alert system. There's multi-sectoral assessment. There's an organization that does they're either going out of business or radically losing their funding. And so what we're seeing is that all the most necessary parts are being lost, and unfortunately some of the ones that you might want to get rid of are actually staying. And there might be a system, and people talk about a broken humanitarian system. It could be, not wanting to project too much doom, there could be a sense of actually it collapsing in certain places, with certain parts of it actually not able to function anymore. The whole system then falls down. Even if you think about there's a UN humanitarian aid service, if that can't fly the planes, or people can't deliver things. So we are kind of in that territory, and it's a bit into the unknown. But it does describe also the way that the humanitarian system is structured. So as Jane was saying, it's a solidarity movement. It's about a humanitarian mission. This is what drives organizations. It's about humanitarian action being seen as a public good. But it's also, and I've written about this recently, it's also a marketplace. It's about organizations whose objectives are not only to fulfill their humanitarian mission, it's also to receive income, to grow. And we've seen this, it's become corporatized. Organizations have been, gone from a few $100 million into the billions. We have, CEOs who are being paid up to $1 million a year. They're being, rewarded for increasing their income. And, agencies have gone, loopy on just going crazy for the money in some ways. And many of them are in denial. I mean, many of them were, despite making cuts last year, they were projecting further growth this year. Everything will come back. The money will get turned on. And so because it is structured in this way, you have donors that give the money, you have UN agencies and large NGOs who take it, and then they are meant to pass it on to local actors, but often don't. They really are still competing about all the resources now, and that's their motivation now, is to retain market share. So you want these things, their main, preserved, to keep their employees. And so because of this, you'll get, and many of them operate like a monopoly, that they will maintain their market share, their position, and then the smaller organizations who would want to flourish are the ones that are going to go out of business. And so this is because all the economic incentives are skewed in some of the wrong ways. And so played out, we might get, you know, things coming out the other end how we wouldn't want them. And that's precisely why, you know, a lot of it should be about trying to change these different incentives, breaking up the structures and organizing it in a different way and kind of, yeah, improving it. As Jane said, many of the ideas have been stuck around for reform for a long time. Many of these things are extremely well known. It's just there hasn't been the willingness and leadership to make sure they happen. And that's what really needs to change now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We have 30 to 60 minutes, I think, to open up the conversation now. And I think we're certainly open to taking questions, but also if people have comments, thoughts, ideas that you want to share. I'm just going to see if I can deal with this technically, which might be the most challenging part of all. So there's a few questions already have been typed into the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand, in which case I will attempt to turn on your video and microphone so that you can ask your question live. We would ask if you can let us know who you are and what organisation you're from, or what you do, where you're coming from, before you ask your questions. But I think I'm going to go first to the questions in, oh gosh, a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I'm seeing there's maybe one or two that are overlapping. So yeah, let me start with, I'm going to put a couple of questions together. One is, do you believe there is hope for young international professionals, brackets, entry level, in these circumstances? And another from George O'Shaughnessy saying, a bunch of us are graduating soon after years of dreaming to put our skills to work in humanitarian and development aid. How can we make sure we're able to contribute amidst these cuts? So this is two very kind of career focused questions, and then I will, if I leave you two to kind of reflect a bit on them, and I'm going to go through the questions in the box and be ready to ask you for some more in a second.
Damian, do you want to start on it, or do you want me to?
I don't mind. You don't want to go? Yeah, you go first.
Okay, I'll give it a go. Completely understand why you feel the way you do. I mean, I suppose, again, there are many different ways of answering this question, aren't there? Is it, in my view, absolutely essential that young professionals come into the sector and drive change within it? Yes, very definitely it is. So I think the first thing is to say, never lose your confidence, never lose sight of what you have to bring, that freshness, that newness, that commitment, that sense of, I absolutely have to be involved in this. I have to make change in this. That is, in many ways, that is gold dust within a sector, which is frankly at the moment feeling extremely bruised, extremely undermined and undervalued. So please, that is a plea, I suppose, to start with, to say that it is absolutely critical that young people come into the sector and change it and move it on, as it always has been. You know, every new generation brings something new. The question, though, that I guess you're really asking is, how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way which is a sort of has some form of definable career path? And I think there are several answers to that one, which again I would love to hear back from you. So pop it in the chat if you've got a second. The nature of the skills and the jobs that there will be has always been changing, and it will always continue to change. So it is not a question so much as having an international sector, which is all about doing and delivery. It's about having an international sector, which is about supporting and adding to. And so that is a different set of skills. And the nature of the job and the nature of how you do it is always going to be slightly different. I think what there will also be, and this it ultimately has to be a personal choice. Over the last 20 years or so that I've been sort of perhaps talking more to people coming in, as you know, I went through my sort of, well, here's my first 10 years in the sector, is it feels as though there's been an expectation of a much clearer career path than perhaps there was when I started. And I think being part of the humanitarian endeavour, if you like, is going to necessarily involve less of a defined career path and more willingness to be flexible. And that will sit better with some people and some circumstances than others. And I really hope that there will continue to be greater clarity of what a career path looks like. But I think inevitably we're going to go through a time where we're going to have to be more flexible and perhaps live with more uncertainty. But honestly, it has never been more necessary and more valuable than it is now to have new young professionals with new ideas come in and new ways of working. And I think that the progressive, open-minded organisations will be really looking for people like you. And if they're not, they should be. And so go and tell them what you have to offer and how you will do it. But I'm sorry that's less of a defined answer than perhaps you might wish for, but those would be a few thoughts.
Damian, do you want to add anything there?
No, I think we don't have too much to put on. I think James put it really well. I mean, you know, I wouldn't underline that it is quite a bleak moment at the moment in terms of jobs. And even if you look at the Relief Web, which is one of the ones where most of them are advertised, you can just see the numbers drop off. It's quite extraordinary. But I mean, the encouraging thing is, well, hopefully we are at the low point. I mean, actually, if you look, you know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if you were to get into the sector and then suddenly be hit with this, you would be, you know, last in the door, first out the door scenario. So hopefully for those that will be graduating quite soon, you hopefully will get in at the, you know, the bottom, and, you know, only up from here, I think, is where we want to see things go. And in that sense, yeah, I would totally agree with Jane. I think, unfortunately, the sector where it has kind of evolved and become more professional, at least in the UN, it's appalling in terms of a assured career path. And so yeah, you do have to be kind of entrepreneurial about the ways you go about this, but there are definitely ways to do it. And I think exactly what Jane says, we need new ideas, we need innovation, we need different ways of doing things. There's just been too much stuck in their ways about that happening. And a lot of the more volunteer organizations, I mean, I started out working with Médecins Sans Frontières. It is a solidarity volunteer organization. You might not get paid as much as others, but it's definitely one of the most professional organizations like that. Have not seen so much as their income drop off. They rely on private donations rather than governments, who they refuse to take the money most of the time. And so those organizations will thrive. There's going to be many local organizations in terms of becoming more local. I work in Mozambique with a local consultancy firm And it's definitely the most encouraging part of the work that, I do. So, go and work with a local organization, try and support them in a place. So there are different ways to do this. And I think, you need to be entrepreneurial and about how you go about it. But, I'd hope that the opportunities are still out there. And certainly we need everyone's contribution at this time.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to collect together 2 or 3 questions now, which relate to what has driven the funding cuts and how they might be reversed. So I'm going to, I think there's 3 questions I'm going to read out, but for you to answer together because they're sort of all on the same theme. One is from Layla, who's a PhD student here in HCRI. And she asks, as these funding cuts are political decisions, how likely is it that these decisions will be reversed in a few years with the change in political leadership of major donor governments? I think another related question is from Vincent Wooding, who says, I agree with much of what's been said and appreciate hearing your perspectives. To what extent are these cuts merely the political manifestation of the fact that we have failed to effectively make the argument for ODA and humanitarian assistance with the general public? And finally, we don't have a name on this one, but I think another related question is, how can humanitarian organizations engage the public and policymakers to advocate for sustained or increased aid funding? So do you want to take those 3 questions together because they're kind of all on a theme?
Damian, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I do think we have to be realistic. It is a product of the changing geopolitical situation. And if you look at obviously the Trump government coming in, and amazingly, Trump won, their contribution to to overseas aid went up. Yeah, so Trump first administration led to a significant increase in US aid. So this time around, obviously, they've come in with a completely different agenda, a populist agenda, and it's been about slashing the federal government to fix their kind of political agenda. So I think we have to be realistic about that. And then, what's shown that also is also the number of other governments in which has taken a similar stance. And I suppose, Jane and others will know the situation better in the UK, where I haven't lived for a long time, but it is as well as it's a reaction to that. And if you see, the UK decision going from 0.5 to 0.3 to fund defence aid, it can only be seen as an offer to the populist electorate who would like to see a slash in budgets. But it's also quite ironic that this is a Labour government, or worse, it's tragic, not ironic, that it's a Labour government that's presided over this, whereas the previous Conservative government, who we thought was doing a terrible thing in merging DFID and the Foreign Office and going to 0.5%, actually, bring them back tomorrow. That's what we want. So it is also, I suppose, just an inevitability of the financial situation in which many Western, governments find themselves. They need to slash their budgets. They're, finding it very difficult to have kind of economic growth. So in that sense, I think there is a danger that, until the world changes and political things move and we see a much more, support for liberal politics again, things might change. I think if there's an economic uptick, I mean, we also saw aid budgets slashed in terms of the 2009 crisis. They took a number of years to come back. But if the economic situation in many countries does improve, I think, as Jane was saying earlier, I think a lot of donors will just find it inevitable that they will be put on the spot. So I think it is a product of that. I think, the other arguments, like this is our own failure and we didn't reform and we should be more efficient and we failed. I mean, I think there is an element of that, and I think it is just astonishing, many of the proposals now, that you think, well, these are the same proposals that were being made before, but no one was acting upon them. I mean, efficiency has never really been truly considered a priority in aid work, in my view, about trying to make the most. It was always seen as the ends justify the means. We're here for a humanitarian cause. It doesn't matter if we have a very expensive way about what we're doing. And so, in that sense, it is more efficient. But I don't think we can just blame it ourselves. I think if we do, we just play it into the, you know, Daily Mail readership. Aid is just a waste of everyone's money. So we have to be kind of very, very, you know, clear on that. And so, yeah, it is a product of the political situation. It's a product of the aid agents perhaps not doing it well enough in terms of whether they sell it well enough with the public. I haven't lived in the UK for a number of years, so I'm not really best placed to do that. But from what I've read recently, the numbers are about the same about people who do want to give abroad, as far as I've seen, is that is quite a constant. Like people do, there's people who don't want to give abroad, there's people who do. That's kind of a constant. It's just how politics, you know, reacts to that and who might be in political power. So if that is a constant, what we need to do is to build on those people who do generally want to give to causes abroad. They're still the same people. We still, you know, but we need to change the politics with them, and we need a much stronger narrative about why aid is positive. There is too much within the aid sector of just this constant, we're a broken system, we can't do a good job. Like, it's amazing how people do not speak in a positive way about what we're able to achieve. Now, some of that's probably inevitable, I'm sure, you know, in the NHS, again, to make the parallel, people are just stuck in a very frustrated way when they don't feel under-resourced, but it doesn't in any way devalue the work that they're doing. And so we have to build this positive narrative. There's been innovations, you know, humanitarian aid saves lives on a daily basis. There's evidence for that, and we need to go out there and project this image. And because if we don't, we don't have any hope about changing the political circumstances.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you've said there, Damian. I really would. And I think to answer the questions, you know, I mean, will we see a reversal in future years? I'm not a political scientist. I don't know. I do think and this is as far into politics as I will stray, I do think that the UK decision to fund additional aid spending exclusively from the aid budget was an extraordinary one. It felt as though it was an unnecessary one, because the amount of money that was required could easily have been more broadly spread, or could easily have been raised by, you know, there have been lots of campaigns about, you know, 2% on billionaire tax and so on. So it does feel as though it was an extraordinary decision, and as Damian said, a populist one, even though there wasn't a huge amount of populist demand for it. That was the bizarre thing, and I think we have to name that. And feel free to disagree if you would like. And deeply disappointing, as Damian said, that it was a Labour government. I can't believe it. Have we failed to make the public argument? I think we probably have. And I think, you know, why have we done that? How have we got into that? I think there has been a trend, particularly among the big NGOs in recent years, to focus so much more exclusively on delivery. And that consumes organizational energy and time and brain power, and it also drives risk-averse decision-making when it comes to speaking out, and that's a critical thing. So that more, if you like, the campaigning role of the humanitarian sector has become much more muted in recent years, I think, and that is where the argument for aid was traditionally made. And I think we have collectively made mistakes in bringing that down, and we need to learn from that. But we also cannot, you know, one of our greatest strengths is our greatest weakness. That's always the way, isn't it? Our ability to self-reflect and then to beat ourselves up about it is huge compared with many other walks of life and sectors. And I think we've done perhaps a bit too much of that too publicly. We need to redress the balance. Where do we go in terms of making the public argument? Well, and again, this may be a very simplistic way of seeing it, but somebody I worked with on the fundraising side of Oxfam said, repeatedly, people do not give to organizations. You think that they give to Oxfam. They don't. People give to people. So you have to tell them about people and you have to put them in touch with people. And in a world where, you know, social media reaches the furthest flung corners of the world, and where you can genuinely put people in touch with each other and build those relationships through social activism, using that for a positive, for building that sense of cohesion, that sense of caring, and that sense of proximity and closeness. You know, humanitarianism means your problem's mine because we're both human, and we now have means of understanding the daily round of each other in ways that we never had before. And that has to drive public interest and public engagement with each other. And so I think for me, that is always the opportunity. I mean, for me, you know, sort of very basically, I think one of the best moments, certainly a meaningful moment that I remember is, you know, very late one day in Oxfam, you know, having something, you know, somebody come down from, I don't know, supporter marketing or some other totally different bit of the organization from the humanitarian part of it, coming down and saying, you know, look, somebody's been on Twitter, as it was then, from somewhere in the Philippines, saying their Oxfam pump doesn't work. And what are we going to do about it? You know, that was brilliant. That was somebody with a phone and a broken pump thinking, well, these people put their sticker on it and told me that it was going to work. It's not. How am I going to tell them? And clearly, having failed locally, use social media for it. I mean, brilliant. If that person in a camp of, I think it was after Typhoon Haiyan, is going to do that, can't we join people up a bit more? And that sort of movement, that's a global solidarity movement, I think, and it builds on this. People give things to people, not to organizations, or sometimes not even to causes. So that for me is, again, the big opportunity and the big opening for the next quarter of the 21st century. But I don't know. I'd love to know from people who understand a lot more about that as to how realistic that is.
Thank you, both of you, very much. I'm going to try now. I can see we've got a hand up. Jerome Grimaud, I'm probably butchering your surname there. I don't know how I can turn on. Andrew, can you help at all? Can you? Yes, brilliant.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jerome, and I'm just coming back from Gaza, where I was there for about 8 months as SIMCORD. I'd like to build on what Damian said a little bit. I see a lot of opportunities in the current in brackets crisis we are experiencing. First, I think it's an opportunity to look at salaries that are being paid in the humanitarian system. Damian mentioned that, he mentioned CEOs, but someone like me in Gaza was earning $10,000 US per month. There is absolutely no reason, no justification for that. So even if my salary had been cut by 2/3, I would have had a very good salary compared to any social worker working in France for the same basic qualification at the end of the day. So I think we need to look at that, where we allocate resources. And also the funding system. I mean, taxpayer give to government and give to UN agencies that give to big INGOs that give to local NGOs. and at each of these stage, someone is getting a cut. So we can definitely make that more efficient and more, I would say, decent and fair. That's one thing. Two other opportunities I see is that we could really now activate what we call localization big time. I mean, we have less resources. Those who are the most efficient in using them, with some technical support, our national organizations, is the right time to actually make our promises real. Another opportunity I see is to focus more on prevention, more on protection, understood as reduction of violence, and less on assistance. We know that assistance comes after and is more costly. So it's also an opportunity to use this crisis to focus on prevention and protection as understood as reduction of violence. And I'll stop here. Thank you for taking my comments.
Thank you very much. Do you two want to respond to any of that?
Completely agree, I think, with all of it. I think it's going to be the really difficult bit is where you draw the line between response and prevention. I mean, that's where the real discussion needs to happen, I think. But on everything else you've said, yes, completely agree. And that's, I think, the opportunity is to really drive into that localization. And that localization is not, it's an awful word, isn't it, anyway? But it is not just contracting. I did a piece of work last year, which the overwhelming response from national local organizations, particularly to a lot of the larger and the UN organizations, was you're not empowering us, you're just contracting us, so please be honest about it. And we have to get away from that. So yes, I think all of your points are very well made, Jerome.
Yeah, likewise, Jerome. Good to speak. And yeah, I think your first comments, it all comes down to just efficiency and value for money being taken far more seriously in the humanitarian sector. And it starts with financial transparency. I mean, there is not, especially the UN agencies have to provide very, very limited amounts of information about how they spend money, their salaries, as you mentioned. And there was a few raised eyebrows of what you said then. And so it starts with financial transparency, and then it starts with a requirement that, you know, agencies should be required to say what is the unit cost for each of their activities, what they're able to do with those activities to save lives or whatever the other might be. And there should be an honest discussion about, is money being used in the best way? Because up until now, there had just not been this level of scrutiny. There's been a lot of evaluations, audits, processes like this. There's ICI in the UK who does different studies about whether UK taxpayers' money, but it's reviewing things programmatically. We need to look at it much more financially. Is money being used in the best way? And then the localization, I think there's one thing that's come across from this is that in terms of the addressing of power and what's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years, if there's one big trend of, you'd hope that, you know, 15, 20 years time, whatever, when you're all doing one of these kinds of webinars or whatever we've done in terms of AI, that, you know, it will be very much a locally led response and it won't be this kind of international. I think the real danger is that localization, I've worked a lot on this, I've been in many meetings, no one will ever disagree that it's not the right thing to do. There's people who might say, well, there's a due diligence issue, but people agree with this. So you have to ask the question, like, why is this not happening? There was a commitment made 10 years ago to provide 25% of all money as indirect or as directly as possible to local agencies. The figures now are at 3%. Why hasn't it changed? It's because it's the same organizations that are competing over the same money. Why is a big UN agency or a big, you know, even NGO going to give money to agencies, local agencies, when they're competing for the same money? It's much better to deal with them in terms of a subcontracting way than it is to deal in that way. So you have to change the incentives. You have to make this just a requirement. It should be a mandatory requirement. There should be regulation just to make this happen, I think, rather than wish that this is suddenly going to happen by people changing their minds. So these are the organizations that have been most hit by the cuts that everyone wants more money going to, but it really, really requires a complete restructuring the way that aid is delivered until that's going to happen, I think.
Great, thank you very much. Let me move then to, and Andrew, can you help me out again here, to Vincent Wooding, who has a hand raised. Hi, Vincent.
Hi.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. I'm Vinny. I'm a PhD student in Manchester in the School of Politics, and I'm doing my research on the politics of international development. And I also have spent the last 10 years working in the development sector, and I'm still working alongside it. So this has been a very interesting session for me. It's been really interesting to hear both Jane and Damian's perspectives. I sort of wanted to drill down on something that I think Jane was sort of moving towards, which was, I think certainly from my perspective, the development sector is, as we say in Liverpool, cabbaged. It's kind of 25 years out of date. It really needs modernisation. And I think one of the biggest things that we could do in that regard is around the discourse of development. And I think this kind of relates to my question that we were saying about the argument with the general public. I feel like the discourses that underline development are really outdated, still very patronising to parts of the world that require development assistance. And I think really embed a kind of cyclical and ongoing process that doesn't really solve anything, but makes us all in the West feel good about ourselves and feel like we're doing something, but we're actually really not. So I think my question is to kind of both of you is like, how do we begin to move away from kind of harmful discourses that have plagued the development sector since its inception? How do we move away from them to incorporate more kind of international solidarity language, more on the human rights agenda, and less away from kind of geopolitical considerations? Development is about eradicating poverty and overcoming these global inequalities, but we have not been effective in doing that. And I think part of the problem is because we haven't told that story very well to people. So yeah, I'd be curious just for your perspectives on how you think the language of development is actually inhibiting it.
I think there's an interesting point there, and there's a really key difference between the language of development and the language of humanitarianism, I think, and they're clearly closely related. And where the balance is I think in rights language. And to be honest, there are some organizations who for years have been embracing rights language, not needs language, and that leads you much more closely down a road of figuring out protection and really making it clear that you're not talking about generosity, which is sharing something, but actually just shifting resources in the way that is the right way to do it. And I think quite often there is, again, in my experience, a lot of the communications, a lot of the representation of what is being done is perhaps based on the lowest common denominator of assumptions, rather than saying we are not going to be able to persuade everybody all at once. What we want to do is build constituencies of people who believe in this stuff and build on that. But it does take investment, and that is a big issue, I think. So not really an answer to your question, partially agreement and partially reflection on the fact that some of it has been done, but as you say, somehow we have not managed to build that all together. And I think the final thing I would say, and this is almost a question back to you, Vinny, is quite often a lot of that doesn't happen because it is perceived as being too political. and, you know, speaking as somebody who's spent nearly 20 years working for an organization that was, you know, sort of reported to the Charity Commission for talking about the blockade of Gaza and things like that. You know, I mean, it does lead you down a much more risky political route. And there needs to be, you know, greater embracing of that level of risk. But I think, where do you see that political side of the discourse really being an opportunity? Would be great to hear. But Damian, you may see it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just
Different perspective.
you thought about this more, and it'd be interesting to hear from you. And I think what that narrative is going to look like, you know, in 5-10 years, it's got to be different from behind, but in the past. But you know, how can we kind of sell this? I think just maybe playing devil's advocate, and one of the things to be considered is that, you know, the expansion of aid in the last 10-20 years happened because I'm presuming you're learning all this in your studies, but my understanding is it aligned with the foreign policy interests of many Western governments, and that's why you saw the expansion. You know, first Labour government, Tony Blair, he said there's 3 things I do internationally. I deal with the US, I deal with EU, and I have DFID. That's what he said. He said, my soft power in the world is DFID, and these things are aligned. And we saw, you know, obviously Afghanistan, Iraq, but also a lot more interest of these countries in it. So, you know, there is an argument, well, until that returns, until you make aid part of the political interests of these governments, will you get a return to aid to these places? Now, that obviously comes with a lot of the politicization of aid that we wouldn't want, but I think there is a realistic view that, well, maybe that is only one way that you can get a, you know, a return to that thing. The other thing is that you're saying is that, you know, you don't want this politicized. You want much more of a kind of solidarity movement, a lot of connection, and a different way that people will see their interests aligned with those in other parts of the world, and think that it's not only a moral thing to do, but it's also within their interest. I mean, one of the ones that, you know, and I wasn't in the UK for COVID, but I always thought was quite interesting is COVID in some way was a little emergency in the Western world, because if you sat in Africa, this was not an emergency for number one, and they had millions of different kinds of disease outbreaks. Like, we have this kind of thing all the time, like, what is so different about this? And so it was a bit this kind of role reversal, and you would think, I don't know, to take something out of that experience, that you would hope that everyone can see that people are facing similar kinds of challenges in the world. And, you know, you'd hope from, you know, migration is kind of unstoppable in many ways, that people will start to identify with things in other parts of the world. I mean, the outpouring of support for, you know, Ukrainians as compared to others is, you know, there is still that kind of identification. But what that kind of looks like and how that plays out politically, I don't think I certainly don't have the answer to that, what it looks like, but it definitely needs to happen.
Okay, I'm going to collect together another 3 questions from the Q&A box now, which builds a little bit on Damian, your response mentioning DFID and this being sort of Tony Blair's soft power. We have a few questions about what's in the interests of donor countries to donate, essentially. So the first one is from Johnny, who is a surgical trainee in Yorkshire and also part of GASOC, a trainee-led organisation empowering trainees to get into global surgery. And Johnny says, Damian, you mentioned that we need to show that humanitarianism is not just a moral cause and that it's good for the country. Could you please expand on that? In what ways does humanitarianism benefit the nation, apart from us being seen as good people? Somebody else, possibly even almost in answer to Johnny, says, one of the rationales of these aids is producing soft power for the host country. How should we understand those cutting funding from a soft power context, or from thinking about soft power? And one more, which I think, if I can move up my screen, was slightly different, but I think also related. This is from Isabel Morale, who says, I'm interested in how this might impact the global North countries that are cutting funding, i.e. what challenges might arise in time in those global North countries from these funding cuts. So, Damian, since the first of those questions was directed at you, do you want to take a start here?
I mean, you know, in terms of it not being just moral, it being in kind of self-interest, I mean, I think, well, the soft power arguments, others probably will know it better than me. And I think there is a debate whether it really is you know, an effective soft power tool. But the fact that, you know, aid can see to be given to you know, create markets in places and promote trade and investment in places in UK. These things should be aligned. I mean, I still think there's, you know, an argument to that, but there's quite a, you know, hard-headed reality is it's, you know, the UK at the moment, if you think we're spending, is it 30% of our aid budget on refugees in our own country? Yeah. The net outflow of money of debt relief is going from developing countries to the UK. I mean, these are kind of absurd realities about what's happening. So even under a kind of Daily Mail kind of agenda of why the hell we're paying for all these refugees on our own, you know, soil, you know, 90% of all refugees do not come to Europe, or they go to neighboring countries. It makes a lot more sense to invest in a refugee regime, and we had the Global Compact on Refugees a few years ago that is built on this burden sharing, but supporting those countries that you know, have refugees in more locally to them. It is demonstrated within our interest to do that. So yeah, I think it's not to be exaggerated, the kind of soft power things, but there seems some pretty straightforward things that the way that we've designed our aid is in a pretty kind of nonsensical view at the moment.
Thank you. And Jane, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add to it, I mean, the influence and the strength of relationships that emerge from respectfully and mutually beneficial aid flows is incredibly strong. You know, it's the oil of international relations. And when you have within international fora, just in a very practical way, delegations from different countries who are able to speak to each other, to work together on global initiatives and global global compacts, you know, whether it's around climate change, whether it's around disease control, that sort of ability to build relationships and to have information and mutual interest flow around just feels like a much more efficient way of working, rather than, you know, we're in our corner and you're in yours. And I think we quite often just forget quite how small the planet is, and simply oiling the wheels of international relations is, and aid is part of that, as well as the moral case, is absolutely invaluable. Without that, nobody's going anywhere. That's
okay. Thank you. So I think we can probably squeeze in 2 more pairs of questions. So the pairings are now getting a little looser, but still I'm trying to bring things together that can kind of lead to combined answers. So one question here is, what mechanisms exist to ensure that humanitarian aid remains effective in war-torn areas despite budget constraints? So just, you know, if you can answer that, you've solved half the problem. And then a second one, this is from Ibrahim Efe. And Ibrahim is a researcher at the Global Development Institute working on displaced Syrian communities and youth agency in return context. And asks, with major cuts to USAID and UK aid spending, how do you see the humanitarian sector adapting to the growing needs of Syrian returnees, particularly at border regions where returns are expected to increase? And what role, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but what role might local actors play in addressing the gaps left by international donors? Jane, do you want to take a start on those 2?
Yep. Shall I give it a go? I mean, just on the mechanisms for effectiveness of aid in conflict, I mean, it has to be simply around good resource management, but above all, very clear community relationships and engagement. That has always been the way to monitor assistance in conflict, in active armed conflict, is through the relationships and the information which is closest to the ground. And good agencies will have those set up very strongly. But I think the other thing is by being very honest that you will never, particularly in the messy, noisy, chaotic environment of armed conflict, you will never know where everything goes. You have to accept that some of it will go missing. And the question becomes, what is an acceptable proportion to go missing? And if it's around 50, I've been involved in various discussions around this with communities, with donors, and with individuals who give to humanitarian response in conflict, and you know, that there is recognition of that, and we shouldn't say that we can absolutely track everything. That would be crazy, but it's keeping it to an acceptable level. But it is always through strong community-based monitoring that you keep things as tight as possible. And in terms of the Syrian question, I don't know if Damian knows more about this one. I don't know enough to be able to say anything particularly about that particular group of people. But I think the important thing is that, yes, you're absolutely right. Engagement of local organizations on the ground is going to be absolutely key to that in a much more resource constrained world. But it shouldn't be seen as filling gaps left by international agencies. It should be seen as, well, this is the way it should have been done in the first place, both for reasons of efficiency and effectiveness and understanding of what's needed. It's going to be the better approach anyway. So I think what is likely possibly to be the resource-driven answer is also the right answer. And that's where we come back to using this as an opportunity to let go of international control in many environments.
Yeah, I mean, maybe picking up from there, I think the question about like effectiveness in war situations, one of the things that has been an evolution recently is not just, you know, conflict being a impediment to accessing populations, but also estranged governments. So we have obviously the Taliban in Afghanistan, we have the military junta in Myanmar, we have the Houthis in Yemen. Most of the Sahel has experienced various coups, and so many of these places, you know, this notion of international aid is completely turned on its head. Like I did a lot of work in Myanmar. At least 70% of all international aid workers working on Myanmar are not in Myanmar, i.e. they work remotely from various places all around the world. And so it does underline, I mean, for, you know, people going into this, you know, career, I would really try and make sure you have as much direct contact and experience of this, because you don't want to do it remotely. But it does call into question that, you know, maybe we need to see this as an opportunity. In Myanmar, most of the aid goes from remittances and providing money to local actors, sending you know, money and cash in convoluted you know, ways of transferring money, which is very difficult given the banking system. There's a big risk of diversion, but as I totally agree with what Jane says, that's often over exaggerated. But we do need to think, although it's, you know, challenging that we don't have access to these places, it causes us to do things in a completely, you know, radically different way. So we have to see this as an opportunity. Syria, I have worked on Syria, been there, but I mean, it does provide the example also for aid workers. I think it was those that worked in Gaziantep on Syria. So this is the first generation of aid workers who went to Gaziantep in Turkey, worked on Syria and never visited Syria. So, you know, that is the kind of example. But now Syria is opening up. There is an opportunity. There's been a lot of local, I imagine you're probably the person who asked the question knows it much better than me, but there must be many, many local actors that have been built up given the inaccessibility of the country so many years. And if it is really going to open up, it really has to be about supporting them rather than imposing some enormous structure, which simply there won't be the money for. I mean, normally what you would have, I think, Syria, they would be like, right, we'll set up this massive, you know, machinery. It just won't happen. It really is, again, an opportunity to do it in a different way.
Okay, great. We just have a few minutes left. I was going to pair two questions from oh, something's just moved on my screen and I can't see them anymore. Two questions from PhD students in HCRI. One is from Tom Page, who's an HCRI PhD student, but also ex-Oxfam, and says, hi, Jane, but has a question too. And he asks, do you think that the funding reductions will also come with increasing controls and on any restricted funding that does remain? Will there be an increase in donor contract compliance demands, or will there also be fewer donor personnel to scrutinize contract performance? So kind of how will the sort of donor operational and agency relationships change, or how do you expect them to change? And I was also going to read out Layla's second question, but I can see she's got her hand up as well, which suggests she might want to jump in on something that's just been said. So Andrew, can you turn on Layla's mic and then we'll let her jump in here?
Hi, yeah,
Go ahead, Layla.
Wanted to elaborate on that question because we heard previous audience members saying there's a need to make a better case for development and focus on more prevention as opposed to response to violence. But I wonder to what extent these are actually problems contributing to this humanitarian funding crisis as opposed to being a solution. Because the humanitarian sector overall expanded quite a lot in recent decades. And that's partly because of needs, but also partly because of mission creep. I think humanitarians have tried to address root causes of violence and conflict and try to do more long-term transformative work instead of focusing on life-saving assistance. So yeah, I wonder to what extent maybe this funding crisis is actually an opportunity to kind of go back to the more limited definition of humanitarianism that focuses on life-saving assistance.
That's a good one. Do you want to go first, Damian?
Yeah, maybe just on the second question. So yeah, I think one of the kind of debates going at the moment is this kind of back to basics view versus the more kind of transformative nature of humanitarian assistance. And as you said, you know, over the last decade or so, there's been this kind of Christmas tree approach where there's been added resilience, climate, many of these other things that the aid system could do, much of which I think has been about positioning and making sure that agencies could just have more funding, and certainly into the kind of climate sphere at the moment. I think one thing humanitarian agencies are not able to do is they can deal with the consequences of climate change, but they're not really within their power to do it. So I think, yeah, as you said, this could be an opportunity to go back to basics, as it were. The problem is that all this resilience longer term stuff would then not get funded. And the development actors who were already very reluctant to work in many of these places have also had their funding cuts. And I was speaking to someone at the OECD today that, you know, also agreed those development actors are going to shift into easier places to work. So you're going to kind of lose it from both ways as people diverge into their keeping their lane and diverge into what they do. And then the people in the middle, this more kind of transitional, will be lost out. So I think that's the danger of it. I think the only way to address this is to turn the question on its head and to say, look, we just need to really collapse this kind of humanitarian development peace divide. I mean, if you look at many of these places in practical context, people have problems. They do not have humanitarian development problems. They just have problems. It's really insulting to go to these labels that we say that they have a category of a problem that we define. They just have problems. And most of these things are just indistinguishable. You're trying to build people's livelihoods. You're trying to provide for their basic services, you're trying to provide for their shelter, you're trying to provide their education. So I would promote a more radical view of this so-called nexus, where you really collapse these different ways of working into a far more integrated way. I think that's the only way of addressing the challenge that you've just underlined.
If I can just agree with what Damian said, and I'm sorry, Leila, I would counsel against going too far back to we just do the humanitarian stuff. And that's for several reasons. The first one is, how are you going to define that? Crises don't start on Tuesday and finish on, 6 months and 3 weeks and 2 days down the line. And having started work when that approach was much more prevalent for all sorts of practical and political reasons, I think overall it means that the costs of humanitarian response are much higher. The number of people you reach are much lower. And you end up returning far more frequently and starting again from scratch. And there was so much of that going on in the 90s. I think we need to look much more into the practicalities of what that would actually mean. So I think it's a much more detailed conversation that needs to be had on that one. And I worry about seeing it applied too much sometimes in some of the conversations that are being had around the reset and so on like that. So apologies not to agree with you on that one. On Tom's point of, will reduced funding mean greater compliance? I suspect it will. I think there is going to be, just the kind of discussions that are going on at the moment about what's going to be funded and what's not. Much more, there's much more detail being required, even in basic proposals, and much tighter monitoring. Some of which is good and fine, and some of which is perhaps not entirely cost efficient, I would say, but I suspect that is the case, yes, and it seems to be emerging as the case at the moment.
Great, thank you so much. We are out of time. I want to say a massive thank you to the audience for a really great set of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through them all, but I think, we got through some really interesting, got to discuss some really interesting issues there. And also a massive thank you, of course, to Jane and to Damian. Maybe there are a couple of questions I'm not going to read out, but that ask, I think it would be a nice note to end on, that sort of ask what we as students or we as members of the public can do to support humanitarian aid or to support local level NGOs that are most at risk of closure. So I just wonder if I can challenge you to end with a note of optimism, or a note of encouragement, of a very short note of encouragement or optimism of what people in the audience, what steps people might be able to take to kind of engage in the kind of solidarity that you were talking about, Jane. So can I give you sort of 30 seconds each?
Sure. I would say in terms of direct support, there are a lot of consortia of national and local organisations, and reach out to them. Reach out through social media, follow them, contribute to them, and just engage and start to build those relationships, because it's out of those personal relationships that real progress is going to come. And so that would be my suggestion. Look for those consortia, look for the ones that are really representing their members, and commit to them. And be in there for the long term.
Thank you. And Damian.
Yeah, I think Jane mentioned it before. There's just the way the world is there's so many ways of making connections with different kinds of organizations, different kinds of individuals. I'm amazed that everyone here hasn't had some experience, even locally in the UK or traveling abroad, where you won't make some connection with some organization working in some thing, make the connection and support them in different ways. And I think then the biggest support with the kind of political narrative is we have to project this, humanitarian aid is morally important, but also fundamentally within our interests, and it can have massive impact, and it does have results. I think if we fall into this narrative of aid is problematic, the system was always broken, we're doomed. So we have to really tell this positive story about how it can have an impact, and I think there's many examples of that.
Great. Well, on that note, we're 1 minute over time. Let me just say again, thank you so much to Jane and to Damian, but also to our audience.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.